So we had already mentioned this, but we said that in 2019, the US GDP was $21.427 trillion. Now, the year before, in 2018, the US GDP was $20.580 trillion. So if you notice, we had an increase in GDP of almost $1 trillion from 2018 to 2019. Now, based on that information, one or both of the following statements must be true. Either our GDP increased because our economy was producing more goods and services than the year before, so we were more productive, we were making more stuff, or the reason our GDP is higher is because the goods and services are being sold at a higher price than the year before. Because remember, we said that GDP is used by calculating the value of those goods and services. So if things are now more expensive, that could cause our GDP to go up. But if our GDP's purpose is to measure how productive our economy is, which one of these statements would indicate that our economy is being more productive? Well, if we look at this one on the right, that has nothing to do with productivity. Just because stuff is more expensive doesn't mean our country made more of it or was better at making stuff. It just means it's more expensive. However, the one on the left, the idea that we're producing more stuff than last year, that measures if our economy is actually more productive than before. But by just looking at the numbers, how do we determine which one of these statements is true or which one is false or just however it might work? Or another way we might ask it is, how do we adjust for those prices changing over time so that our data isn't skewed? Well, what we do is we end up measuring our GDP in two different ways. One of the ways that we measure our GDP is through something known as nominal GDP, or it's also known as our current dollar GDP. Nominal GDP is just whenever we measure the production of goods and services and we value those at current prices. So whatever the price is of that good or service at the present moment. Real GDP, however, also known as constant dollar GDP, measures or values the value of those goods and services at constant prices. So we kind of take a price and we keep that price the same from year to year to year. Or another way of saying this is that nominal GDP is not adjusted for inflation, while real GDP is adjusted for inflation. So what does exactly it mean that we're using constant prices? Well, what we end up doing is we choose a base year. And the United States has been using the year 2012 now for a little bit while. They change that year kind of as they move along, but they always choose a base or a constant year. Then what they do is they use the amount of goods and services produced from our current year, but we value those goods and services by the price of those goods and services in that base year. So that way we're always using the same prices. And so we're really kind of adjusting to the price changes from year to year to year by eliminating those changes in prices, by just keeping it with the same prices across years. So how does this end up playing out? What difference does that end up making? Well, looking back at this data, those first GDPs I had showed you were what we call our nominal GDPs. So in 2018, our nominal GDP was $20.58 trillion. In 2019, it was $21.427 trillion. However, if we attach these to our base year, we see that in 2018, the real GDP with a base year of 2012 was $18.6 trillion. And in 2019, it was $19.0 trillion. So nominal GDP here is telling us that we produced $846 billion more worth of goods and services in 2019 than in 2018. But again, that's actually not entirely true because remember, prices could have changed. We said one or both of those statements might have been true. And what we end up knowing from historical data is that prices did change over that time. So if that's true, we have to look at what we call our real GDP. Because real GDP here actually indicates that we only produced $434 billion more worth of goods and services. But in fact, during that same time, prices increased on average by 1.74%. So that means some of that change in our nominal GDP was because prices went up, but also some of it was still because we actually did produce more stuff than the year before, just not as much stuff as our nominal GDP would indicate.